Hey all, so I'm going to try vlogging, or video blogging, I guess, because it might be a little bit more efficient than trying to type this out. So I had an interesting exchange this morning on Twitter with one of my friends and colleagues, Ben Miller. He's the director of the Farley Health Policy Center here at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. We were talking about stigma, and we both share an interest in stigma, and he said that payment reform could ultimately help with mental health stigma more than many other things. He said, so in order to really, if we were really prioritizing what we could do to reduce mental health stigma, Ben was arguing that at the top of our list should be payment reform. And I disagreed with him. So I wanted to say a little bit more about why I disagree, or where we do agree, where I think we might agree, and where we might not agree. So I think when I teach about stigma, one of the things I think is really important to understand the definition, right? So stigma is really two things. And I'm tracking Link and Phelan's definition here for those of you who are interested. So you get stigma when you have difference plus deviance. What does that mean? Well, there are two different phases, as I see them. The first one is the difference phase, where an in-group marks an out-group as different on the basis of shared demographic characteristic, right? So that's the difference prong. And then there's the deviance prong, is where the in-group that's marked the out-group as different assigns a notion of deviance on the basis of that shared demographic characteristic, on the basis of that difference. So when you have difference plus deviance, you get stigma. But it seems quite simple, and actually there's a lot of really important things that flow from that definition. The first is that stigma is actually linked to social structures, right? Because the in-group has to be an in-group in order to be able to mark the out-group as different. So they have to be empowered, right? So the in-group marks an out-group as different. It means that stigma is connected to larger social inequalities. Social life is complicated. We are, most of us, members of multiple in-groups and out-groups at the same time. But some people have the great misfortune of being a member of more out-groups than in-groups, right? Multiple out-groups. And so what flows from this is the idea that, if you're a person who has, the sort of unfortunate fact of belonging to multiple out-groups and very few in-groups, you're already likely to be more stigmatized in multiple different domains and areas of life. And that can include health stigma, but it can include other kinds of stigma, racial discrimination, right? For example, gender-based discrimination, disability-based discrimination, and stigma in all of these categories. So stigma is structural. That's the point. It's connected to larger social inequalities, and it's connected. That's inherent in the definition. And so part of the reason I disagreed with my colleague Ben on here is because, the idea is, look, payment reform, practice transformation of models of healthcare delivery, right? Of delivery, the structure, delivery, and financing of healthcare. Those are great. I'm not opposed to those things at all. And I'll talk about that in a minute or so. But, that's really something that's internal to the delivery structure and financing of healthcare, right? That's not touching the larger social structures that are really driving and fueling stigma and determining the distribution of stigma in our societies, right? So, we can do anything we want in terms of payment reform, even if we're in favor of it from a whole bunch of reasons. That's just a sort of a little model. That's a little system. It's not really the root causes of stigma. It's not the structures of stigma that I think we ought to be most concerned about. So, that's really where that came from is, look, I argue, and I'm not the only one who argues this, but if you really, really want to change stigma, and this includes mental health stigma, this includes pain stigma, weight stigma, all different kinds of health stigma, you'd have to address the social structures that are driving these kinds of things, right? It's no accident that the groups that are most likely to be subjected to different kinds of health stigma are already more likely to be disenfranchised and marginalized and oppressed groups, right? And so, in the United States, of course, we're talking about people of color. All over the world, we're talking about indigenous peoples and these kinds of things, right? So that's really the most important in terms of priority setting of interventions for reducing stigma. That's what we're talking about. Now, of course, that's structural. We're talking about social, addressing, transforming social and cultural structures, not transforming practices of healthcare delivery and not practices of reimbursement, right? And so I just don't think that those are the most important things we could do. It's not more important. And that's where I sort of disagreed with Ben. Now, to sort of go back and say where I think I might agree with Ben is one of the ideas that I work on quite a lot, and I'm actually trying to work even more on, I'm sort of moving even more into this, is the idea that laws and policies are very important mediators of stigma, right? So the laws and policies we have, they refract, they're almost prismatic is the word I like to use, right? They really sort of refract pre-existing stigmas, and they can either intensify stigmas against marginalized groups, against people who are members of the outgroups of issue, or they can actually, I think, ameliorate the stigma. And so I think it's really important to look at that. And in fact, one of the things I'm really interested in is doing public health law research, or what's now being called legal epidemiology, to look at whether we can change law and policy in ways that will result in, and I do mean result, that will result in amelioration of existing forms of health stigma. and whether or not we can determine that the links between those changes in laws and policies and changes in levels of health stigma are actually non-spurious, so that we can say there's, a likelihood that there's something really going on here between these changes in laws and policies. So that being said, is it possible, as Ben seemed to want to say, that our models of reimbursement, our models of payment are channeling, are intensifying, mediating, refracting health stigma? And I say, yeah, sure, of course it's possible. It seems quite likely. Now, I do say it's an empirical question. Whether or not changing those models will reduce stigma is an empirical question. We can speculate about it and conceptualize and form lots of, I think, pretty reasonable and informed hypotheses about what might happen, but it is an empirical question. I think really the only way to evaluate it is through these methods of public health law research and legal epidemiology. So that's where I would agree with Ben. I would say, look, there's lots of things we could do in terms of changing laws and policies in ways that might ameliorate stigma that people are experiencing. One of those ways might very well be payment reform and reimbursement reform. And I think that that's probably a promising avenue of inquiry. I'd be willing to say as a hypothesis, I agree, it probably would tend to reduce stigma. But there's a difference between anti-stigma interventions through laws and policies, which I think are very important, and arguing that the most, promising and powerful ways of really altering stigma in a fundamental social way are really the only thing we can do is address these larger social inequalities. And we're not going to do that through the healthcare system. And that's what's really important in my view, right? I mean, the title of my blog, the sort of the little piece there says, health is a social and political problem, not a technical one. We're not going to resolve stigma as a social and a political problem. We're not going to resolve social and political problems through technical solutions to payment reform and practice transformation. Now, that may not be what Ben meant, but that's sort of what I interpret it to be saying, and so I think that those models are really important, and we could probably structure them in ways that I think if we evaluated it, my hypothesis would be they would be likely to reduce certain kinds of perceived stigma. Certainly mental health stigma might be among them, but I don't think in terms of priority setting for anti-stigma interventions, those would be at the top of my list. There are other ones that are going to be more important, and they're involved in sort of much larger upstream social conditions that are, I think, quite far removed from the actual delivery structure and financing of healthcare and behavioral healthcare included. So that's sort of what I think. Let me know what you think about this, my first attempt at vlogging. Yeah, thanks.